Have you ever just stopped and wondered why a tiny, cramped little apartment right in the center of the city costs exactly the same as a massive, sprawling four-bedroom house out in the suburbs? Or, why is it that when you're walking through a downtown core, you only ever see towering corporate offices and high-end retail, but literally never a sprawling manufacturing plant? I mean, why does downtown dirt cost more than rural gold? It's a question that dictates our daily commutes, our monthly rent prices, and really the very shape of the civilization we live in.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to unpack the hidden, almost invisible forces that completely shape our cities. We're diving deep into the foundations of geography and real estate. We're going to break down how classical economic geography, and we're talking about theories born way back in the 19th century, how this stuff still directly dictates the modern real estate market, your rent, and even the exact location of your favorite coffee shop. It is an absolutely fascinating journey, so let's just get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the roots of real estate. Second, the central business district. Third, why cities form. And finally, modern site selection. All right, section 1, roots of real estate. To really understand today's rent, we actually have to look backwards. Because to truly wrap our heads around today's astronomical rent prices and crazy urban sprawl, you have to realize that the concrete jungle as we know it is built on a foundation of agricultural theory. Let's trace this intellectual leap over time. We've got to start with David Ricardo. He was an early economic thinker who theorized that land rent was basically based on its productivity. Then, in 1826, J.H. von Thünen took this massive leap forward. He looked at a hypothetical, flat, isolated agricultural plain and realized something huge. Transport costs dictate land use, and this creates these concentric rings of farming around a central town. Fast forward a bit to 1964, and William Alonso comes along. He takes von Thünen's agricultural rings and brilliantly adapts them to the modern city, which gives us the urban bid-rent theory. Let's look a little closer at von Thünen's basic logic here, because it's literally the engine for everything that follows. His model states a really simple equation. Basically, rent at any location is equal to the value of the product minus production costs minus transport costs. It all just boils down to distance. Think about it. If you're farming right next to the market, your transport costs are practically zero, right? So you can afford to pay high rent. But if you're 50 miles away, your transport costs are massive, meaning you can only afford very, very cheap land. Distance equals cost. After all, dragging a horse cart full of cabbages 50 miles cross-country isn't exactly a cheap endeavor. Moving right along to Section 2, the central business district. Let's see how this exact agricultural model translates to the concrete jungle. And this brilliantly illustrates how the geometry does the heavy lifting through Alonso's 3D bid-rent curve. If you picture a peak right in the center, that's the CBD, the central business district. Absolutely everyone wants to be there because it's the single most accessible point in the whole city. But as you move away from that center, the amount people are actually willing to pay, their bid rent, just drops off. The outer surface of these intersecting sweeping curves forms what economists call a declining land value gradient. Simply put, the closer you get to the center, the steeper the rent. So who actually wins the fight for this incredibly expensive central land? Well, we have three main competitors. First up is commerce. Think your large department stores and massive corporate headquarters. They desperately need foot traffic and huge populations to survive, so they are willing and, more importantly, able to pay the absolute highest rent for that inner core. Next is industry. Factories need space, sure, but they also need really good transport links, so they tend to settle in the outer core, paying kind of a medium rent. Finally, residential. Everyday householders don't need a massive commercial marketplace just to sleep at night, so they naturally seek out the cheapest land, which is farthest out. Now, you might be wondering, what does this mean for me? Well, this dynamic creates the modern trade-off, and it directly impacts your wallet. According to Alonso's model, if you want high accessibility to jobs and the city center, you have to trade away living space. Hence, the tiny downtown studio apartment. Conversely, if you want a lot of space, a nice yard, a big house, you have to trade away that accessibility and move to the edges of the settlement where land is a whole lot cheaper. You are constantly balancing your space against your transport costs. All right, Section 3, why cities form here. Let's shift gears to central place theory. So we know exactly why the center of a city is so expensive, but why is the city located right there in the first place? To understand why settlements form at all, Walter Christaller's central place theory tells us we actually have to look at how humans shop. He categorized things into two buckets: low-order goods and high-order goods. Low-order goods are things like a loaf of bread or a daily newspaper. You buy them all the time, but you're definitely not going to travel very far for them. High-order goods, on the other hand, are things like cars or fine jewelry. You buy them very infrequently, but you're totally willing to drive a long distance to get them.
So the crucial point is how these everyday goods create two invisible economic forces: threshold and range. Threshold is just the minimum number of people required to support a business. A local bakery, it needs a pretty small threshold, but a luxury car dealership, that needs a massive one. Range, on the flip side, is the maximum distance a consumer will actually travel to buy that specific good. Together, these two forces entirely dictate whether a business, and by extension an entire town, will survive in a specific location.
Just imagine a single business sitting right in the center of an isolated town. If we assume the world is perfectly flat and transport costs increase evenly in absolutely every direction, a business's market area naturally forms a perfect circle. The inner circle is the threshold they absolutely need to survive, and the outer edge is their maximum range. But, in the real world, you don't just have one business. You've got competitors everywhere.
Let's move on and see how this builds when competitors enter the picture. If you pack a bunch of circular market areas together, you inevitably get these empty, unserved gaps between the circles. To capture those unserved customers, the businesses naturally push outwards. The circles begin to overlap, and mathematically, they literally compress into hexagons. This is Christaller's extremely famous hexagonal lattice. It's the most efficient geometric way to serve all customers across a landscape without leaving a single gap. So our cities and towns are essentially functioning as this giant, invisible mesh of hexagons. Crazy, right?
Section 4, Modern Site Selection. Let's see how all this classical theory holds up today.
Now, all of this 19th and mid-20th century theory is incredibly elegant, but does it actually hold up in the messy, chaotic reality of the 21st century? Well, to test this, researchers from the Pacific Rim Real Estate Society gathered some really extensive data on land values across the metropolitan area of Adelaide, Australia. And honestly, the results are stunning. Decades after Alonso published his theory, the data still perfectly matches the prediction. Retail shows the absolute highest land value right at the city center. Commercial creates this high-value cluster right around it. Residential values show a smooth, declining gradient as you move away, and industrial land sits right at the lowest value out on the outskirts. The classical geography of real estate is absolutely alive and well. Now, of course, the real world isn't just a completely perfect, smooth, theoretical curve. There are always deviations in the data, which economists like to call residuals. And this is exactly where locational externalities come into play. A theoretical model assumes land is perfectly uniform, but reality just isn't. If an outer ring suburb suddenly gets a beautiful new public park with amazing views, while the land value there is going to spike way higher than the theory predicts. Conversely, if a neighborhood is built right next to a loud, heavily polluting factory that completely ruins your weekend barbecues, the value is going to dip way below the curve. These quirks shift real-world prices for sure, but that underlying geometric gravity of the CBD, it remains firmly intact. Which really brings us to a fascinating crossroads. We've seen exactly how distance, transport costs, and physical accessibility have built the hexagonal networks and concentric price rings of our world for the last 2 centuries. But I want to leave you with a rather provocative thought to chew on. If your office is now located entirely inside your laptop, and you simply don't have to commute to the central business district anymore, what happens to the bid rent curve? How will remote work and instant digital accessibility warp von Thünen and Alonso's perfect concentric circles in the years to come? It's a literal geographical revolution happening right now, right under our feet. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.